today to give a historical retrospective of electronic information systems. My name is Edward Johnson, aka Eddie, and I'm the president of InfoEd International. I'm here today with Pat Johnson. Pat Johnson was the vice president for sponsored programs of the Research Foundation of the State University of New York. She retired back in 2006 after a 40-year career in electronic research administration. How are you today, Pat?
I'm fine, thank you, Eddie. Nice to be here.
How did you get your funds from the government? I know nowadays a lot of places take advantage of drawdowns. Was that the same mechanism?
Yes, we had drawdowns.
But now drawdowns are done electronically. How did that work, to your recollection, prior to that electronic mechanism?
I don't recall it ever being other than electronic. I'm sure back in the early 70s they probably sent us checks, but I really only thought, for the most part, it's been electronic that I can remember.
Okay. So then probably the checks, I would imagine, would have to be after the fact.
Yes.
So the reporting to the government was done on what basis? I know you said the effort reporting out and the financial reports out to the staff were monthly. What was your reporting requirements back to the government?
I think it was annual. It was annual as far as I remember.
Okay. Now then, back in I believe you said it was in the 1980s, you were responsible for the technology transfer there at...
It was around 1990, yeah. I was responsible for tech
me.
transfer, yes.
Now, that has definitely been an area that has evolved over time. What aspects of that did you see and what did you find difficult to manage? What were the problems of an office back then?
I think the expectations were that tech transfer was, by Dole standards, required because any research done with the federal government funds had to protect whatever came out of that, if anything came out of that research. So the expectation of the faculty was, if there was a so-called invention reported, that we would certainly review it and then send it for patent process. That's a very costly endeavor. It isn't always possible. So we reviewed all of the invention statements issued by the faculty or reported by the faculty and had to make very difficult decisions on what we thought was marketable, eventually licensable, which was a very small percentage.
I mean, I know many investigators, even today, essentially think that everything that they disclose should be patented. But the reality is, and I suspect it was the same back then, is that because it's such an expensive process, if there wasn't the anticipation that you were going to license it or make money on it, then sometimes it was not practical to patent everything you could. Even if it could be patented, you didn't necessarily do that.
That's correct. And those dollars were real dollars. And the patent process, even back then, was easily $10,000.
Wow. I think it's up in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken.
It probably is.
Right.
But back in the 90s, that was a lot of money.
Now, did you manage the licensing aspect of that? I suspect you did.
Yes.
So you must have had a team. I know nowadays they have like marketing staff, if you will, that literally go out and try to identify opportunities to license the technology.
That's correct. The most prolific were our medical centers, obviously. Inventions that came out of there. I think one of the major advances we made is that we decided that non-exclusive licensing would actually get us more money, would get us a better return for the money spent than trying to get an exclusive license. So we achieved some modest success in non-exclusive licensing of a lot of techniques, bench-level techniques that came out of the medical centers.
So how did you see that evolve over time? I mean, how long were you involved with that facet of research administration?
I directly managed it for about 4 years, and then when I became vice president, it was still under my purview, but we had a director that we hired at the time, or a vice president.
I know time and effort requirements basically evolved, and you described how those were managed in that area of your control. But do you remember, I believe the first electronic submission system that I recall was NSF FastLane. I think they had toyed around with the EDI 194 dataset prior to that, but then FastLane came online, I believe it was 2004?
I don't recollect the exact year, but it was probably around that time. And there was a lot of nervous faculty that would then rely on their local office to make sure that this was actually input correctly and it got there and got the correct acceptance back. And so they would be nervously awaiting this out of their hands control it was rough not having that paper anymore.
What was their original perception of that? It sounded like they were nervous, to say the least.
They were very nervous. Well, remember, when you're not in control of the piece of paper that you've put your life's work on, and you're going to rely on some clerk in an office to get that input into the NSF FastLane system, that takes a lot of trust.
Now, they did have, to my understanding, a review mechanism that once it was in there, then the investigators did have a chance to review it, right?
They did, but we're talking about timing. And you only have a certain length of time, and faculty are busy, so that also became another stressor.
Now, the awards that came out of that were still paper at that time, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they were.
I want to thank you for taking the time to go over this today. It's been a very interesting trek over your 40 years and how ERA has evolved over it. So thanks again.
You're welcome.